It all started on an ordinary autumn day. The leaves danced outside the window like they had their own plans for the future. In Class 9B, tension hung thick in the air. It was the day of the algebra test, a subject most students at school number. 17 treated like a personal enemy. For Jaden, though, it was something more. Jaden was a boy with a sharp mind and a tough life. He lived with his grandmother, who worked as a janitor at the same school. Each evening he returned home to a cold house and a bowl of oatmeal. There was no money for tutors, and he read textbooks at the public library because they had no internet at home. But what he did have was a dream. He wanted to become an engineer. He believed math was the key. In the now famous photo, Professor Blake, known for his strict discipline and a reputation carved over decades, stood beside Jaden with his arms crossed. Behind them loomed a chalkboard filled with equations, inequalities, and derivatives. The scene looked like it was taken straight from a courtroom rather than a classroom. What happened? Jaden had made a mistake, or so they thought. He had solved a problem using a different method than the one taught in class. His answer was correct, but his approach wasn't by the book. To Professor Blake, that was a challenge. "You think you're smarter than the system?" he asked, his voice cold. The classroom froze. Jaden didn't speak. He had spent a sleepless night studying. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't guessed. He had understood. But none of that seemed to matter. "With your level of knowledge, you're not going far," the professor added, louder now so the whole class could hear. A girl in the back lowered her head. Some students started whispering. Jaden felt his face burn with embarrassment, but something deeper inside, something stubborn, began to stir. After class, Jaden approached the professor. "You can take the points away, but I didn't cheat. I can explain how I solved it, in front of the whole school if I have to." The professor said nothing, just studied him for a moment. He didn't just see the torn yellow t-shirt and worn jeans. He saw defiance, clarity, and belief. The next day, the school principal summoned Jaden. Without announcing it publicly, Professor Blake had submitted Jaden's work to the city math competition. Anonymously, the evaluators had reviewed dozens of submissions. Jaden's was declared the most elegant, precise, and insightful solution. Weeks later, Jaden received a scholarship. A technical university had offered him early preparatory courses. A year later, he became a student in the applied mathematics department. His advisor? Professor Blake. But the story didn't end there. During his first semester, Jaden became a quiet mentor to other students struggling with math. He remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be judged by appearance. He volunteered at the library where he used to study, running free weekend classes for underprivileged kids. One afternoon, Professor Blake visited one of those sessions. He didn't say much, just watched. Then, at the end, he walked up to Jaden and said, "You were right. Method doesn't matter when the mind is clear." Jaden smiled, nodded, and kept teaching. The chalk dust on his fingers was no longer a symbol of struggle. It was a badge of honor. Years later, Jaden would go on to build learning platforms for underserved communities, combining engineering, mathematics, and his own story. His name was known in circles that once would have laughed at a kid with holes in his shirt. The lesson? Sometimes brilliance doesn't look like a top-grade student in a clean uniform. Sometimes it walks into a classroom tired, in torn clothes, with something to prove and something to change. Respect doesn't always come in applause. Sometimes it comes in silence. Sometimes it comes years later. But truth always finds its way through. Jaden still solves problems in his own way. And every now and then, Professor Blake proudly tells new students about a boy who once made an error X and changed everything. Jaden's life at university wasn't easy either. While others had their parents pay for dorm rooms and meal plans, he worked nights in a campus cafe, pouring coffee for students who would never know the struggle behind his calm smile. His mornings were lectures, afternoons, tutoring, nights, study and work. Sleep was a luxury, but so was giving up. One particular winter, Jaden was close to breaking. His grades were slipping. The pressure to succeed was enormous, and he didn't want to disappoint the people who had believed in him. He sat alone one evening in the dark corner of the university library, surrounded by books, but feeling completely lost. That's when he got a message from Professor Blake. It was a simple text. "Come by my office. We need to talk." Jaden, expecting a lecture, dragged himself across campus. But when he entered the office, Professor Blake surprised him. "You remind me of myself," the professor began. "Stubborn, quiet, determined, but unlike me, you had no one at your back. That changes today." He handed Jaden an envelope. Inside was a letter, recommendation to the university's fellowship program, and a grant application for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Blake hadn't just written the letter, he had gone to the dean himself. "You think you're alone, Jaden," he said, "but you're not anymore." That moment reshaped Jaden's world. It wasn't just math that saved him. It was a mentor who stopped being a gatekeeper and started being an ally. By his third year, Jaden had published his first paper, an innovative approach to solving nonlinear systems using adaptive logic methods, inspired by the very equation that had caused error X. He presented it at a national conference where his name was recognized, and his story, shared by Blake in a quiet aside, became a symbol. The boy in the torn yellow shirt had outshined them all. Now, Jaden lectures part-time, runs a nonprofit tutoring organization, and travels to under-resourced schools to inspire students who remind him of his younger self. His story is more than one of triumph. It is one of quiet revolution. A single error became the turning point. Because sometimes, the most powerful answer comes from the wrong question. Years passed. Jaden, now in his late 20s, was a guest lecturer at several institutions around the country. One day, he returned to school number 17, the very place it all began. A dusty classroom, a familiar chalkboard, and a memory of who he once was flooded over him as he stood in front of a new group of students. Among the students sat a girl named Lila, bright-eyed but clearly withdrawn. Her clothes were too big for her, her shoes were scuffed. Jaden recognized the look. He saw himself. After class, she approached him, holding a worn-out notebook filled with her own unconventional math scribbles. "I think I solved this problem," she said shyly, "but it's not the way the book says." Jaden grinned. "Show me." They sat together, and as he looked through her pages, he nodded slowly. It wasn't just correct. It was brilliant. A spark, the same one he once carried, burned in her eyes. That day, he gave her a copy of his book, signed it with the words, "Never be afraid of the wrong path. Sometimes it's the only way to find a new one." Jaden never stopped being a student. Every encounter, every classroom, every mind he saw awaken reminded him that math and learning wasn't about rules. It was about freedom. And the yellow shirt? He kept it, folded neatly in a box at home, a reminder of how far he'd come and of how far someone else might go.